Good evening. I get the honor of doing the introduction tonight. Jean has something in her throat, or she couldn't pronounce Calambokidis. I can't remember which one it was. So I just wanted to thank you for this, for attending tonight, and I'd like to say big thanks to Camp Rock Island and SeaDoc for putting this on, especially for all the donors that do that this year. Tom and Vernon of Deer Harbor Charters, Barbara Brown, Dean and Audrey Stupke, and West Sound Marina have been huge, and co-sponsors with Barbara Bentley and Glenn Presswich, Bill Patterson at Chimayo Sazio, and Emmanuel Episcopal Church, of course. Tonight we have the honor of having John Calambokidis from Cascade Research Collective here to talk about harbor porpoise, probably one of the most commonly seen cetaceans in the area, and probably one of the most understudied cetaceans that we have in the area. So we're honored to have John. The one caveat is that we got to rush out of here at 8 o'clock. So, because John's got to make a ferry. So we wanted to, so John is actually coming. He's got a huge trip tomorrow, but still came up for the lecture tonight. So we're grateful for that. We want to be appreciative and let him make his ferry tonight. So he said he'd be happy to take some questions along the way. If he gets tight for time, he may not take a question or two, so don't feel offended with that. And also, just wanted to say thank you to all you guys for coming tonight. Appreciate it. John.
It's actually a big benefit to all of you that I have to catch a ferry, because sometimes I tend to go long on my lectures, so that kind of puts a finite end. Usually I get, the main species I study are large whales, but some of the first marine mammal and cetacean work I did was on harbor porpoise, and it actually started in the late 1970s up in Glacier Bay, and harbor porpoise were one of the species we had up there. But for most of my early career working in Puget Sound, and I started research on marine mammals in the early 1970s when I came out here to go to Evergreen and Olympia. And as my undergraduate research project started studying harbor seals. But over the course of the many years, harbor porpoise were that species that used to be here and had disappeared out of Puget Sound. And kind of through my career, I've come back occasionally to harbor porpoise. And it's really exciting that we have some very new developments with harbor porpoise right now that are allowing me to do a little more work back on this species that I've kind of studied, I want to say at about 10-year intervals coming back to that. But mostly I spend my time off the West Coast studying blue whales, humpback whales, gray whales, fin whales are the much, much larger members of the cetacean families. Blue whales, the largest of all the cetaceans, and harbor porpoise, the smallest of all the ocean-going cetaceans. So it seems like I've spent time at either extreme on the cetacean size spectrum. There are a number of names of other people up here, and this is probably only a partial list of some of the people that have been involved in harbor porpoise research around Washington State, and who I've stolen some of what I'm going to show you from. And I do tend to show a lot of figures and tables. I know with the screen size you're going to have trouble seeing it, but I'll try to make the very kind of simple interpretation, but I can already anticipate you won't be able to see the details of some of the slides I'll show you on that screen size. First, a little bit of background. And you'll see a map in the lower left corner there, and everything outlined in blue there shows the range of the harbor porpoise. And you can see that it occurs in coastal nearshore waters of both the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. And extends down into more southern portions of the Atlantic. It goes into some of the inside waters. And it goes by different names in different areas. It's sometimes been referred to as the common porpoise in, for example, European waters. It used to also be, and if you've seen harbor porpoise, you'll understand why it's called this. It used to also have the very derogatory term of being called the puffing pig, was another name for it. But you can see that very coastal distribution for one thing, and that's one thing that characterizes harbor porpoise. They're very near-shore animals, and that term harbor porpoise makes sense for that reason. They tend to be sort of hard to study because they are small. They, unlike some of the dolphins or Dall's porpoise that readily approach boats, they generally tend to avoid boats and will even move away from a boat and sound sources, and they don't seem to like echo sounders. They respond to that. They are pretty vulnerable to some human activities, and I'll touch on that, and that's part of the reason I got involved in studying them. Their size is only about 5 feet long. Typical weight is in the 100, 150 pound range, so not very big. They're dark on top and lighter colored underneath, but unlike killer whales or unlike Dahl's porpoise, they don't have a sharp black-white delineation in color. It more fades from light to dark. And you just have trouble getting a good view of them. So unlike if I'm talking about humpback and blue whales and I get to show nice dramatic pictures interspersed with my boring figures and tables, I don't quite have that luxury here. So there'll just be a few pictures because they're hard to photograph. They're tough animals to get close to. They have a pretty short, intense lifespan. They actually become sexually mature at about 3 years old. The average lifespan is only 10 or 15 years, so they're not as long-lived as many of the other cetaceans. And so those are some of their kind of basic characteristics. Now, one of the things that got us interested early on in Harbour porpoise is they do seem to be highly vulnerable. They have a pretty long history of easily being caught in fishing nets, especially gill nets. And partly it's that coastal distribution. It's also that I think they become somewhat oblivious when they're feeding. Some of the areas that they're dense are often areas where there are gill net activities. And probably some other factor is the fact that they don't tend to react well to human activities. So in my early research in the 70s and 80s, we started to document the fact that Harbour porpoise had largely disappeared from Puget Sound. We still had Harbour porpoise up here in the San Juans and in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and offshore, but it was this dramatic change in Puget Sound that kind of characterized some of the early research I did, was trying to document how that had occurred. And it was interesting to look at that time. We looked at other areas like San Francisco Bay, the Baltic Sea, the Wadden Sea in Europe. These were areas that used to have large Harbour porpoise populations, much like Puget Sound, where those populations were in trouble in those areas. So it seemed to be a little bit of a unifying theme around the range of Harbour porpoise, that they had trouble where there was lots of fishing activities or heavy human activities. And I just grabbed this. If you can, the National Marine Fisheries Service maintains these what are called stock assessment reports that document the different fisheries that interact and are known to take Harbour porpoise. And I won't bother going through that. Now, one of the early things that we became involved with, and because it was a critical issue, and it's often something that's underestimated in trying to kind of manage and protect marine mammal species, a critical element is understanding how the population is structured. And what I mean by that is often you have mortality in very specific areas, and you can estimate how dense Harbour porpoise are and how many there are in a big area. But unless you understand to what degree there are distinct populations in different areas, you don't know whether to manage the whole giant area as one group and consider, a localized impact is going to be quickly replaced by animals from outside that area, or to what degree do they form these very regional-based populations. And so a lot of early research that I did was trying to tease out different ways that we could figure out to what degree was there movement of animals among regions, and to what degree are there these distinct populations. And for example, this is on the right, you see a map of the West Coast, and on the West Coast here of the US, Harbour porpoise extend down to Point Conception, which is just north of the Southern California Bight and north of LA. And all of those kind of areas that you see separated by lines going up the coast are what are now recognized as distinct Harbour porpoise populations. And I'll show you a little bit of the research that led to realize that it wasn't just one big population on the West Coast. So the earliest study, and you can sort of get a feeling it's an early study because it's a very crude map there. That's actually from the days where when you wanted to do a map, rather than do it in GIS, you would actually draw it and use press-on letters. So this is a map from those days to generate it. But what this comes from is in my earliest research on harbor seals, I had been studying contaminant levels, PCBs and DDTs. So we ended up looking at this in harbor porpoise and comparing the ratio of some contaminants, PCBs and DDT in particular, to each other, but also another compound called HCB, and looking at how it varied, because we knew these compounds were highly stable and they accumulated through the lifespan of the animal. And while you saw quite a bit of variation in how, depending on the age of an animal, how high the concentration might be or its sex, the ratio tended to be fairly stable in a region. And when we studied this up and down the coast, what it actually revealed, and on this left side, you'll see little clusters of points. That's where harbor porpoise stranded, and we tested them. And these largely ended up showing highly distinct ratios of these very stable contaminants. And it right away told us that these were pretty distinct groups. If there was a lot of intermixing, you'd see much more overlap than we were seeing. And we had a couple of ways we could look at this. This is what's called a discriminant analysis. And basically those kind of polygons you see up there kind of encircle all the values of a particular group of harbor porpoise. And you can see that they tend to cluster differently. Now that was kind of our earliest effort. But now there have been some more sophisticated methods. And now this is an interesting study that unfortunately hasn't really quite seen the light of day. It made it into an unpublished report. But this is work that Brad Hansen did, where he actually captured harbor porpoise from up here in a net, because they're prone to entanglement, and attached VHF transmitters to their dorsal fins, and then recorded what kind of positions they got for these harbor porpoise. And what's shown here is the positions they got of some of the harbor porpoise, and there were 4 of them for which they had transmission durations of over 6 months. And each of these different colors are a different harbor porpoise. So bear in mind, each of these sets of points represents positions over greater than a 6-month period. But you'll notice here, all of these black points here encompass one harbor porpoise, and it was never seen outside this region in that 6-month period. And over here is another group in yellow. You have another one that varied a little bit widely from up here down to here, and then there was another one up here, north of Orcas Island that just stayed in that area. So over greater than 6-month period, this was a surprisingly minimal range of movement of these animals. So this also hinted at the fact these animals tend to form fairly localized feeding populations in different areas. And you do see movement, but it wasn't very large scale movement. And then the latest technique that has helped explore this is genetic techniques using something called mitochondrial DNA. And I think, let me just kind of cut to the chase. This is basically locations that harbor porpoise stranded and for which they could examine this genetic marker. And I won't bore you with this complicated figure other than to tell you that it revealed these significant genetic differences among most of those West Coast areas I showed you, and even some hint of separation within some of the inside waters. So these kind of stability of these units was enough that it showed up as a genetic marker. And you had different ways you could plot this, and I don't think I'm going to spend too much time on this. This is some of the divisions looking at California, Oregon, Washington, and how they were clustered. But here's another view of the results of the genetic results, kind of showing some of these blocks and units of samples that came out different from each other. So that sort of gets at this question of distinct population units. Now, the other side of the equation is how many harbor porpoise are there? Because in many cases in these early studies of the fisheries, we had an idea of how many harbor porpoise were being killed, but we had very little idea out of how big a population that was. So now we had a sense of what the population units were. How do you count harbor porpoise? And the main technique that's been used is aerial surveys. That aircraft that you see there is called a Part-Navia aircraft. I'll show you another picture of it. And starting in the 1980s, we began doing surveys with this kind of an aircraft. And surveys were done by Southwest Fisheries Science Center off California, and then Cascadia. I was involved in surveys that were done in cooperation with the National Marine Mammal Laboratory that's based here in Seattle. And just to get a feeling, we would survey coastal waters. And for example, this was our survey design for the West Coast. And you see these different blocks. They represent the area we'd survey, and all the little cross-hatched lines represent the line we would try to fly in the plane to survey. And you'd end up with surveys like this. On the left, you see the lines we actually flew in 2002, for example. And on the right are the locations where we sighted harbor porpoise. So you can see we were getting hundreds and hundreds of these sightings. And you'll see kind of the concentration is highest close to shore, a little less dense offshore. But you can see pretty high numbers of sightings up here in this region up here in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And then here's a little blow-up of just northern Washington and the Straits. Here's that aircraft. It had a plexiglass nose, so if you were, I would typically sit in the co-pilot seat, and you had just a beautiful view under your feet. There are these bubble windows right here, and these would be observers that would sit in the seat right behind the pilot, co-pilot seat, and you could stick your head out in that bubble window and look straight under the aircraft and have a great unobstructed view. Yes?
What do they eat?
What do they eat? I'll get to that. Yeah, we're moving to that. And then you'd have an opening cut in the floor that would allow you to look straight down and count harbor porpoise as you went by. And again, this kind of shows you a little bit of a picture of how harbor porpoise were distributed in that region. Okay, I'm going to jump over that. And these pictures gave us a little bit of a sense of both what the population was, but also start to accumulate data on trends. And for example, there was a lot of concern in Monterey Bay off California because there's been a downward trend in harbor porpoise down there. In other areas, we saw an improving trend in numbers. How about the results for our area? For the counts, this is the results we got in surveys that were done in the early 2000s and the 1990s. And they basically showed that we estimated that in Oregon and Washington, by the early 2000s, we had almost 40,000 harbor porpoise in coastal waters, 10,000 in inland waters, which was the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the San Juan Islands. And what's interesting is that those inland water numbers look like they were increasing from the 1990s here of 3,000 to 10,000 by early 2000s. So it looked like there was something interesting going on in inside waters, even from those early surveys. Now, more recently, it's been harder to get data on harbor porpoise. The most recent surveys we have suggest that at least for this kind of Washington, northern, now just looking at northern Oregon and Washington, which is the new division, so it's a slightly smaller area, the most recent surveys are showing that maybe that has increased slightly from 15 to 21,000. So now let's get to just talking a little bit about Puget Sound, because that's where we've had this interesting change. And I put two quotes up here. One is from the kind of seminal paper about cetaceans in Washington State from the late 40s. And basically it cited harbor porpoise are doubtlessly seen more often than any other cetacean in Washington State. And in southern Puget Sound, harbor porpoise occur in all seasons. And so this was sort of interesting to us because even though we were getting these counts of harbor porpoise in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and San Juan Islands, we were seeing no harbor porpoise in Puget Sound, even though in this early paper it was cited as very common in Puget Sound. And so something had happened by the 1970s that had resulted from the 1940s and 50s to the 1970s. Harbor porpoise had been common in Puget Sound and largely disappeared. And back then we were speculating, okay, what were the reasons for these declines? Fishery interactions, we knew they were getting tangled in nets and dying that way. Increased vessel traffic, we knew they tended to avoid vessels. And we also knew they had pretty high contaminant levels in their tissues. So much of the concerns many of you have heard about with killer whales, well, we had the same concern with harbor porpoise. And we had one other very worrisome thing that's occurred in recent years, and that was a pretty dramatic increase. Actually, before I get to that, let me talk about the change that's occurred in Puget Sound numbers. So this is a figure of sightings of harbor porpoise in Puget Sound going from early 2000s through 2011. And starting in about 2008, we started to get lots of reports of harbor porpoise in Puget Sound. So that was kind of this switch that had occurred. Yes?
The number that says sightings going up the left-hand column there.
Yes.
Is that specific sightings, or is that?
Yes.
Where it says 2, is it just 2 sightings, or?
Yeah, that's specific sightings reported to us.
Okay, and what kind of that says for the whole year?
Yes, for the whole year. And so those are reports coming from the public. And I'll show you a couple of other ways. This was just reports to us of the public that helped alert us to something had changed.
You had 11 sightings.
Yes,
Okay.
right. So a pretty small number still. Now, this figure here is kind of showing what's happened. It turned out then that the Fish and Wildlife Department does these waterfowl surveys where they fly for waterfowls, but they count harbor porpoise when they see them. And this first panel over here on the left shows you where they sighted harbor porpoise in these surveys that included all of Puget Sound. These are from their surveys in the 1980s to early 1990s. This is from the early 2000s, and you'll see just the beginning of harbor porpoise coming back into Puget Sound. And then this is from the last 5 years. And now you'll see lots more of these red dots coming into Puget Sound. So this kind of represents this pretty dramatic change of harbor porpoise extending back into Puget Sound, where they used to be common in the 40s, but had disappeared for close to 50 years. So it's kind of an exciting development. And the numbers, you were talking about how many sightings, but when we look at estimates of how many harbor porpoise that is, so this is some surveys done by the Northwest Fisheries Science Center with small boats. And these faint lines show where they surveyed, and the dots show where they sighted harbor porpoise. And the estimated abundance from these surveys in 2009 was just under 400 harbor porpoise, and by 2010 it was over 1,000. So even though we were first alerted by these few sightings, now when we started to do these systematic surveys, it actually looks like a pretty substantial number of harbor porpoise that are now using Puget Sound. And now, fortunately, more recently, we have surveys that are being done. These are from surveys done this year. It's kind of hard to see the dots, but it basically documents these frequent sightings in both northern Puget Sound extending down into central Puget Sound. So, one of the things we've wondered is what is the reason for this return of harbor porpoise to Puget Sound? I mean, partly we think it's a reflection of favorable conditions in Puget Sound, but what we've really come to conclude is that it's really a growing overall population of harbor porpoise, largely recovering, I think, because of some of the restrictions on gill net fishing that have allowed this population to recover. And here are just a few, like this is taking 3 of our estimates for the overall harbor porpoise abundant in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and San Juans. And in the early 90s to late 90s, we were estimating about 3,000 to 4,000 harbor porpoise, but it had increased to over 10,000 by early 2000. So this inside waters Puget Sound harbor porpoise, the inside waters of the straits, we're seeing an increased number of harbor porpoise, and I think that's finally now expanded into Puget Sound is what's happened. It's kind of neat. There are some new ways now we can study harbor porpoise. One of the ways that's been proving fairly effective is using these instruments called C-pods. Harbor porpoise produce these echolocation clicks, and you can use these acoustic detectors to gather a huge amount of data. So this is a graduate student from Evergreen working with us, deploying one of these C-pods on the right. And this is a technique that's growing in use around the world using acoustic detections. And just here in Washington State now, we have several different groups that have started to use these C-pods as a way to track and monitor harbor porpoise. And ultimately, this might be a far more cost-effective way to monitor harbor porpoise than, say, trying to do these difficult surveys for them. And the sort of data you get, again, this is looking at, for example, harbor porpoise detections from one of these C-pods during just a 2-month period. And you're literally getting thousands of detections using these acoustic means. For every hour of the day pooled across this 2-month period. So it just provides, a much greater volume of data. Now, the other kind of piece of the puzzle I want to bring to play here is to talk a little bit about strandings of harbor porpoise and what they tell us. Because there have also been some dramatic changes in strandings in harbor porpoise. And a number of different groups around the state are part of the Northwest marine mammal stranding network, including up here in the San Juans. And there have been some dramatic changes in the occurrence of these strandings of harbor porpoise. And I'm drawing heavily from work, especially that Jesse Huggins in our office has been doing on these trends and strandings. Now, one of the things that this is looking at number of strandings of harbor porpoise in Washington State starting in 1990. And it just tended to be a handful of strandings. And then you can see that it steadily increased, and especially around 2006, 2007, it went through a big jump upward. And it was enough of a concern that what's called an unusual mortality event was declared because of this increase in number of strandings. But you'll see that in the end, it looks like this increase was largely the result of this expanding and increasing population. And I'm going to just kind of show you that trend as it's extended on now through 2012. So now if we look at this trend, this is from 1990 to 2012, the number of strandings of harbor porpoise in Washington, starting at less than 10 per year. And in 2012, you can see over 80 harbor porpoise were found dead. And this is split between, in red is outside waters and in blue is inside waters. And you can see both of these have increased. And this unusual mortality event is this period right here. And you can see even though this unusual mortality event was declared just for this 2-year period, actually the mortality has continued to increase. Now we have seen some, the strandings and locations of these strandings are pretty broadly distributed. This map on the right shows all the locations of these strandings, and you can see they're pretty spread out from the San Juans, the Straits, and all the way down the coast. I'm going to skip over a few. What it turned out was the cause of death of these animals from examination turned out to be no single cause of death was dominating it. It tended to be a variety of these different disease factors, protozoal infection, a fungal infection. And so this increase in mortality for a while was concerned, was there some biotoxin exposure? Were there changes in food habits that were driving this? Environmental changes? And as I said, now that we have a little better perspective on the recovery of harbor porpoise populations, it's looking like maybe the biggest influencing factor has been that population has increased and the number of strandings have partly increased with that.
Do you have any data where you normalize the strandings to your observed increases in population?
Yes, and unfortunately, I'm kind of doing a good job of trying to tell you what the trend is, but there are a lot of gaps in those numbers to be able to do it. And there's one other factor that we actually have to integrate, which is stranding effort has also increased a little more. We have much more responsive strandings, especially with some of the funding from the Prescott Grants program. So you have a couple of factors that would make that quantitative comparison probably skewed a little bit in terms of trying to make it match up. Now we've seen some shifts in, we do think something a little different is occurring because now this is looking at the strandings not just by number, but now by age class. Adult, which is shown here in blue, subadults versus calves. And you can see a pretty, consistent mix through the years of all of those represented in the strandings up until the last couple of years where we've seen suddenly a much higher percent of adult stranding. And I think what might be occurring here is the population may be approaching carrying capacity, and we may be seeing some mortality of some of the larger animals instead of just the mix. But this is something that we're a little bit concerned about because this is a bit of a change. The other thing that we're concerned about is with the return of harbor porpoise to Puget Sound, there are quite a number of tribal and to some degree non-tribal gillnet fisheries still going on in Puget Sound. And we are seeing an increase in some of these fishery-related deaths, especially in areas like Puget Sound that these animals are returning to. And at this point, we don't have a very good, to quantify how many harbor porpoise are killed in a fishery, you typically need to have observers on board to document the mortality, because just counting carcasses that wash up can be a very ineffective way. Most harbor porpoise would sink or not be recovered, and so you might not be able to get an accurate count. The best way is to get data with an observer program, and we don't have that going on currently in Washington State. But We did see that we did document 35 cases of these fishery interaction in Puget Sound that were occurring. And so we are a little concerned that that may be an issue as harbor porpoise return to some of these areas where there is still active fishing operations. And documenting these mortalities, even when you have a carcass, can be a little bit tricky. You require pretty much a fairly healthy, a fairly recently dead animal to be able to sometimes see some of the subtle signs of either kind of gill nets like you see in the top right, or have lungs and other organs in good enough condition to look for drowning or other causes of death that would be typical of an animal that was tangled in a gill net. One other thing I wanted to mention, because this is kind of a unique thing to the San Juan Islands, is that especially in this area, we have a number of these harbor porpoise and Dall's porpoise hybrids. And it's been kind of surprising to marine mammal researchers around the world that in the wild we would get some of these hybrids between two different species. And I'm going to show you just a couple of examples. These are kind of two different Dall's porpoise, harbor porpoise hybrids that have been recently documented with strandings. One in 2007 that was in Puget Sound that we examined, and another one from 2011 that was looked at by the folks up here, the Whale Museum. And Joe, where are you, Joe? Were you involved in that animal at all as well? So that's the second animal. And I just wanted to show you, this is one thing that we looked at, which was, you'll see sort of three rows here. This is a harbor porpoise, this is the hybrid, and this is a Dall's porpoise. And the table is set up the same way. What we ended up finding is that on many things like number of vertebra, number of ribs, there are a number of features that you can look at what's typical for harbor porpoise and what's typical for Dall's. And in the case of this Puget Sound hybrid, it actually represented sort of something right in between the two species. And hybrids, it looks like, are fairly common in Puget Sound. They were documented in early work by Robin Baird, and going back, I want to say, to the 1970s and 80s. So it's something that occurs in this area. In many other parts of the range of those two species, they're more separated. Dall's porpoise is more a deep water offshore species. Harbor porpoise is much more this coastal shallow water species. But I think there's something with the features we have here in the San Juan Islands and the Straits where you get those two species overlapping. Most of these hybrids are fathered by a harbor porpoise, and the mother is a Dall's porpoise. And you can also get a little bit of a hint of why that would happen that way, because harbor porpoise, some marine cetacean species engage in a high level of reproductive activity. And partly, sometimes it's referred to as sperm competition. They'll actually copulate frequently, and a female will mate with many males. And a feature that you see in the species that do that is they have these giant testes to produce more and more sperm. And so you can look at this ratio of the weight of the testes to the weight of the animal to know to what degree they engage in that strategy. Well, it turns out harbor porpoise have one of these highest ratios of testes weight to body weight. So harbor porpoise males are much more kind of active mating, so it would make sense the hybridization would go that way. It shows that harbor porpoise males, in addition to mating frequently, are maybe not as choosy of who they might try to mate with. The main conclusions that came out of this stranding analysis was that even though we saw this dramatic increase in overall strandings, we didn't find any kind of single cause that was responsible for them. It does look like that we could go through various factors. It looked like the most single factor we can point to is these higher levels of harbor porpoise mortality appear to be normal and associated with this increasing population size, is the biggest thing. I was going to point out in Puget Sound, the harbor porpoise isn't the only kind of unusual returning species to Puget Sound. Since 2010, we've also seen a number of other species of cetaceans that have shown up in Puget Sound that we haven't been used to seeing there. And I can't quite make sense of all of this. Several, like we've had 2 to 3 bottlenose dolphins come and spend extended periods in Puget Sound starting in 2010. And while bottlenose dolphins have been documented this far north, they're primarily a more tropical to temperate species. And the number of sightings of bottlenose dolphins this far north have been fairly rare. And then to have these multiple animals inside Puget Sound for extended periods was unusual. Even more unusual was that we ended up with 2 of these large, very tropical Broodies whales. And that's what looks like Bride's whales up there, but it's actually pronounced Broodies whales. Who here has heard of a Broodies whale? A few people have. Most people haven't, because it's a species of whale that before these 2 animals had not been sighted north of Southern California. So, and we ended up with 2 of them in Puget Sound in the last few years. These were from 2010 that these showed up. Unfortunately, even though they came in alive and were there for a while, both of them ended up stranded and dead. We've had 2 common dolphins, a species that again is much more primarily a tropical species in 2011, extending into 2012. A species that's much more an offshore species, 2 rhesos dolphins, have been in Puget Sound since November 2011 and swimming around. So all of those were fairly unusual occurrences that have occurred. So for a while we were trying to think, is there any connection between the harbor porpoise returning to Puget Sound and some of these other species? And I'm not sure there's really a link, because in the case of the harbor porpoise, their population has been increasing, they're doing well, they're staying. In most of these other cases, these were species that have shown up, and in the case of the bottlenose dolphin, Broodies whale, and the common dolphins, most of the individuals that came into Puget Sound ended up dead. So it's not part of a growing or thriving population. Now we're continuing some of our research on harbor porpoise. So we've got a number of things going on. We're in particular focusing on the continued monitoring of the southern Puget Sound harbor porpoise. And that includes that acoustic monitoring and also tracking individual animals. The stranding research is continuing along with the fishery interactions. We are trying to do a little bit more with contaminant levels, and we've only been able to test a small number of the harbor porpoise for contaminants, but we're trying to look at more, because in harbor seals, the highest contaminant levels were in those animals that utilized and spent time in especially central Puget Sound. It's kind of the area of highest concentration of some of the contaminants like PCBs. And we continue to have a lot of our work occurring in offshore waters. Now, there was the earlier question about prey, because part of what we've wondered, harbor porpoise primarily feed on small schooling fish. And we've wondered if it's a positive indication of the recovery of some of the species like herring. And there are a few positive indications of recovery of some of the Puget Sound fisheries, but overall it's been a pretty mixed picture of how some of the smaller fish that could be prey of harbor porpoise have been doing in Puget Sound. So we're not too sure they're getting drawn back in by a particularly rich prey source. We suspect, again, it's that kind of increasing population that's putting pressure on them to expand into other areas. Unfortunately, our data on prey have been, most of the stranded animals we get have empty stomachs, but there is a prey study going on right now by William Walker at the National Marine Mammal Lab. All of the stomachs of these harbor porpoise that we get are being analyzed, and we hope to get a good compilation of that here shortly. But that's sort of what we're learning on the prey front. I wanted to mention all these other groups that are starting to do research, and partly for that reason, a workshop, the first harbor porpoise workshop, was actually held in February of last year, focused on the Salish sea harbor porpoise. And it was very well attended. I want to say, what did we have, 30, 40 people there, including people from some of the research groups up here in the San Juan Islands. And I think it's rather exciting to see the fact that there's this kind of growing interest now in learning more about harbor porpoise in this region. I put some of the key people that are doing some of this work: Northwest Fisheries Science Center, Brad Hansen, who you might know is one of the lead researchers for the federal government studying killer whales, is beginning an acoustic monitoring program. He's involved in the food habit studies with Bill Walker. There's a woman that, I think the worst advice I ever gave somebody was this woman, Eileen Jeffries. She came to me about 5 years ago, maybe even 6, 7 years ago, and she wanted to do some of the first acoustic monitoring of harbor porpoise in Puget Sound. And I told her it was a really dumb idea because there weren't any harbor porpoise in Puget Sound. And she ended up focusing her research up in the further north in the Anacortes area. But it was shortly after I discouraged her from doing that work, we started to see these harbor porpoise coming back to Puget Sound. And it would have been a beautiful study if she had ignored my advice and started monitoring in Puget Sound. She would have documented that recovery. But fortunately, she's a good sport about it. She's doing some really good work with this group, doing acoustic monitoring of harbor porpoise. And she was one of the people that helped organize this workshop on harbor porpoise. The Whale Museum, and especially some of the work done with some of the researchers at the University of Washington, especially related to concerns about some of the alternative energy developments that might occur in areas like Admiralty Straits. They're doing acoustic monitoring with sea pods and had a program in Admiralty Inlet that is continuing. And then the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is continuing their small boat surveys. And that's actually now morphed into a study the Navy's sponsoring, doing those aerial surveys I mentioned. And there's also research going on in British Columbia on harbor porpoise as well. Okay, so the kind of main take-home message, the points I've driven home is we've seen this return of harbor porpoise to many regions of Puget Sound. It's encouraging evidence that there's at least a healthy enough ecosystem to support the return of those animals. So that's a good sign. The high numbers of recent strandings, and especially those that are associated with fishery interactions, still indicate some of these populations are, suffering from entanglement, and something we need to pay attention to, especially as they expand into some of these areas like Puget Sound, where there are still active fisheries. I kind of have some acknowledgments here, folks, but mostly wanted to try to wrap up enough that I could give you guys, if you have some questions on harbor porpoise, to be able to answer those too. So I know I went kind of quickly through that, but yes?
You cited some of the basic regions of populations, but is there any more information on like the familial structures? Like do they live in pods, or usually when I see them, they're 8, 10.
Right, and harbor porpoise, they do tend to feed in groups. So the group size, what? Yes. So the question was, what kind of social structure do they have? Because typically you see them in groups. And so harbor porpoise do form these groups. They do seem to cooperatively feed, but the structure is very fluid and highly variable. So even in some areas like southern Puget Sound, we're seeing seasonal differences in whether they're in large groups or very small groups. And you can get harbor porpoise as single animals feeding, groups of 2 or 3, or sometimes, and mostly this seems seasonal, you'll see these larger aggregations. And one thing that's interesting about harbor porpoise is that in addition to these kind of tight clusters of groups, you'll see these what we call loose aggregations. So there'll be periods of time where you can get hundreds of harbor porpoise in a particular area. But often those won't be in a social, those will be these little clusters that are broken up. And what used to be one of the best areas to see that was up here off Point Dowdy and just north of President's Channel. I don't know if that's so much the case anymore, but it was partly the reason when we started to do these aerial surveys. One of the things we didn't know, you can fly over harbor porpoise, and count them and do this density estimate, but a key variable is how many are you missing as you fly along, because you've got to correct. And I didn't spend time on it, but in one of those tables I showed you, I had uncorrected and corrected estimates. And what I was correcting for there was for the number of harbor porpoise that were underwater and missed. And we knew it could be pretty high, because then when you're flying along, you're going pretty fast. And so we chose Point Dowdy, and this is I was just reflecting on that recently, because Karen Russell, who's here, was actually one of the people that helped do this study. So we set up a theodolite station on Point Dowdy, and we tracked harbor porpoise groups while we had this aircraft fly overhead. And then while we tracked these harbor porpoise groups and knew how many there were and where they were, we could see how successful the plane would be on each pass in seeing these different groups. And it is now, that little study, which we were just interested in our area, is now actually being used around the world for harbor porpoise studies because it provided this very accurate measure. And in this case, we were only seeing about 30% of the harbor porpoise that were directly on our flight path. And then as they extend further out, you miss more. So it actually, that table that I showed you of uncorrected and corrected is almost a threefold correction you have to make to adjust for all these harbor porpoise that are missing when you fly this very rapid aerial survey line. But this was one of the neat areas. We chose this area because it was an area that you would see these, aggregations of, 100 or more harbor porpoise scattered over a big area, and I still have fond memories of that as a great site to monitor harbor porpoise. Anyone here go out and see harbor porpoise in President's Channel or on the north side of Orcas Island? Do you still see big concentrations?
I've been seeing them for years between Orcas and Waldron. We go to
Yes.
Waldron a lot.
Yes.
About 50% of the time, there's 2 to 3 there in almost the same spot.
Yes.
That's been for well over 1 or 2 decades.
That's right. That's exactly that area. And you don't think you've seen an upward or downward trend? Has that been consistent over the years?
Seems to be relatively
Yeah.
consistent.
Well, that's kind of neat because it's a great spot to see harbor porpoise, and it was one of the more reliable spots. And in that figure I showed you of the radio tagged harbor porpoise, one of those animals you'll see was just north of Orcas Island, and it just stayed there over this more than 6-month period. Yes, Karen?
Yeah, I live with a view, the same view pretty much we had when we were doing the transect studies or aerial studies, and I'd say probably it does seem to me from a greater distance that I can still see animals pretty reliably. After the year, that was in 91.
Yes.
I was part of that. I worked with a couple students out of Moss Landing Marine Lab down in California. It was Cameron Missouri, and
Yes.
doing a study of harbor porpoise feeding behavior, distribution, and it seemed to me at that time that there were more groupings than
Right.
what I'm seeing now.
Right.
I still keep my binoculars within arm's reach.
Right. And I think that
I don't notice those kinds of groupings like we saw
that year.
in the 90s.
Yeah, and I suspect that group structure is partly a function on what they might be feeding on as well as seasonal factors as well. But it does seem to vary. I mean, you look at harbor porpoise studies in other areas, sometimes the mean group size will be 2 or 3, but at other times you'll get it up to these groups of 8 to 10. And it is kind of a variable feature of harbor porpoise, but they do seem to be very fluid and not stable. Even if you track one group of harbor porpoise, you'll see animals break off and join or 2 groups merge. So not the sort of stability you see in killer whales. Yes?
So what about their behavior? They show up and you think you're close by and you go see them again and they're gone forever. It's like, how long do they stay?
Yeah, and they're not diving for tremendous periods. They're diving for fairly short periods, typically in the 2, 3 to 5 minute range. And I think it's more a function of how hard they are to see, and especially if that angle is not sideways, is away from you, it's pretty easy for them to get out of range of sighting them. I mean, one of the other things that made surveying for harbor porpoise challenging is the fact any kind of wind or any kind of wave conditions make them very hard to see. So we would cut off our surveys at a wind speed that would get anywhere near 10 knots. As soon as you got any waves, any whitecaps of any type, the detectability of harbor porpoise would plummet. From the air, we also had to have clear skies. As soon as cloud cover went above about 25%, that kind of, you get more reflection off the water rather than penetration into the water. That would also make them hard to see from the air. So we have to pay attention to wave height, wind, and sky cover, and only in that optimal mix could we actually get that optimal sighting rate of harbor porpoise. So typically we would schedule almost 2 months of aircraft time to get in the 15 days or so we needed to complete the survey. Yes?
Were you able to see them breeding outside of their specific group?
No idea on that. I think, that's the sort of, really interesting questions that you'd love to be looking at and that we have really very little ability to look at. And in fact, even like the calving season and rate of calf production has been tough. They have a pretty short, intense nursing period, and the calves grow pretty rapidly. Harbour porpoise are one of those species that you look at the weight of the calf in relation to the mother at birth, and it's something that for us would be shocking because, it's 20, 30% of the mother's weight is the calf at birth, and you kind of go, whoa, how do they pull that off? And then this short, intense nursing period, and then they're on their own. But it's kind of neat. We're starting to get a little bit of that data with some of these intense studies, tracking animals of they have mostly a summertime calving period that they're giving birth, but kind of who breeds with who and that mating structure is beyond what anyone's done with them yet. Yes?
So when the hybrid Dahl's porpoise and the Harbour porpoise is created, are those offspring sexually viable, or do we not know? Have we had a healthy calf make it to?
Well, that's one of the interesting things. Joe, maybe you can comment on that one that you guys looked at, because it had a fetus. And any comments you want to make on that?
So the San Juan County Marine Mammal Stranding Network that goes to the Whale Museum, the hybrid that was necropsied there was a female, and she was pregnant. So I think it was a good example of you can have your F1 be viable for pregnancy. So
Yeah.
pretty interesting.
Because
Like a Dahl's porpoise that was, like, it seemed like that baby was black with no white on it. So you've never had a baby, like a fetus, come to fruition and be born live? You don't think? You haven't noticed that?
Well, I think, we have these viable hybrids that are swimming out there that were born, and now a hybrid with a cat, that had a fetus in it. So, I think, because we see the same thing with fin and blue whales interbreeding. I think what likely occurs is they are viable, but they probably are at a disadvantage. They don't survive as well in terms of the wild, and, because obviously otherwise you'd get this blending of the two species that doesn't occur. So I think there can be viability, but they might not thrive and reproduce and survive as successfully as either species does.
I was watching this thing about pythons in Florida.
Yeah.
And the guy who was like in your position right now said the hybrids are the hardest to kill. They are so much more able to survive and sneaky and fast. And
Right.
I was like, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
These hybrid snakes in Florida, they're really giving the wildlife capture guys the hard time right now. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes?
Is anybody doing work to, so the gill nets are making a noise to keep the dolphins?
Yeah, and that's a really neat point. What can we do about the gillnet mortality? And what's really interesting is there is a fairly simple solution. It's been employed in several areas like California, and that's that if you put an acoustic pinger, and you can use acoustics in a variety of ways, and I'm not talking about really loud sounds that are, because there are these acoustical harassment devices too, but just that produces a very low-level ping that the Harbour porpoise can detect. It seems to make them aware that the net is there. And so that's been a very effective strategy with a wide variety of cetaceans. For example, almost all the drift nets that are still used to catch things like swordfish off the west coast. Now it's mandated they have to have pingers on them. And it's dramatically reduced the mortality of a wide range of cetaceans, including beaked whales and dolphins. But it's also been very effective on the East Coast and other areas for Harbour porpoise. Right now, none of that is in place with any of the Puget Sound fisheries. So it does represent, a very simple thing that could be done. And I think, there are a couple of ways to approach it. Right now, what I'm hoping, the whole legislative process and mandating it, might take years and years to happen. But what I'm hoping is, especially we can get some of the tribes interested in, rather than turning it into some enforcement legal battle, that they might be interested in doing this proactively. It's partly why I talk about this and have given these talks and tried to get some of them interested. And there are some parties interested in maybe taking the lead and maybe doing some of those protective measures, before it's being forced down their throats, which can create all kinds of, battles and jurisdictions, especially when you're dealing with tribal, non-tribal relations. But there is one very effective solution, and it's those pingers. 1 minute, one more question. Okay. Yes?
You mentioned briefly alternative energy systems, so I was wondering what they were and how they were impacting populations.
Yes, and you know, Europe is way ahead of us on this. Yes, sorry. The question was, I had mentioned alternative energy sources, and the question was, you know, what sort of sources was I talking about, and what kind of impacts are we concerned about? And especially in European waters, that's been extensively studied with harbor porpoise, because there have been these large offshore wind farms in particular there, and sound generated from them that appears to displace harbor porpoise. So they've done these studies with either surveys or sometimes sea pods, and shown that it looks like it's mostly acoustic disturbance is kind of causing the harbor porpoise to avoid some of the areas. Though the most recent paper that just came out on the subject was talking about there seemed to be maybe an habituation that they were kind of, that was, you know, mitigating somewhat over time. I think in our area, there are a number of, alternative energies. Tidal power is probably the one that's closest to home here in terms of Admiralty Inlet. And there you'd probably have a concern with not just sound generation, but actual, mortality of animals that would go through that. And there's not a whole lot of data on that. There was, whether some of these animals would get kind of sucked in and killed by that. There was a paper at the conference I was just at in New Zealand that was looking at, in particular, pinnipeds being sucked into some of these side thrusters of vessels that maneuver in ports. And so, whether there'd be any threats like that a tidal power could provide, we don't really know the answer to. But I think the focus has primarily been on sound and the impact it would have on displacing animals from an area. Okay, thank you.